Karoline Leavitt tells Jasmine, "Go back to Africa. You don't belong in America," on live TV. Until Jasmine reveals Leavitt's family are illegal immigrants from Ireland who falsified citizenship documents. Her father's $200 million embezzlement for veterans charities and the sex trafficking ring she's been running through her campaign offices. The White House press briefing room had hosted its share of contentious exchanges over the decades. But nothing in the room's storied history had prepared the assembled journalists, camera crews, and political observers for what was about to unfold on that humid September afternoon in 2025. What had been scheduled as a routine press briefing on congressional legislation was about to transform into the most shocking exposure of racism, hypocrisy, and criminal conspiracy ever captured in the seat of American political power. The familiar blue backdrop with the presidential seal would serve as the stage for a confrontation that would not only end a political career, but reveal a web of criminal activity extending back generations. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt stood at the familiar podium with her characteristic combination of aggressive confidence and barely contained hostility toward the press corps. At 27 years old, she had become the youngest person ever to hold the position, having parlayed her experience as a conservative media personality and campaign spokesperson into one of the most visible roles in American politics. Her blonde hair was styled in the kind of television-ready perfection that had become her trademark, and her navy blue suit projected the kind of professional authority that had made her a rising star in conservative political circles. But Leavitt's rise to prominence had been built on more than just media savvy and political ambition. Her public persona as a defender of traditional American values and champion of what she called real Americans had resonated with a base of supporters who viewed her as a fresh voice fighting against what they perceived as the corruption and anti-American sentiment of the political establishment. She had built her career on attacking what she termed radical leftists and America-hating politicians who, in her view, represented an existential threat to American democracy and traditional values. Today's briefing had been called specifically to address congressional oversight activities that Leavitt and her political allies viewed as partisan harassment of conservative politicians and policies. For weeks, she had been escalating her rhetoric against what she described as witch hunts and communist show trials being conducted by Democratic members of Congress. Her attacks had become increasingly personal and inflammatory, targeting specific members of Congress who had been leading investigations into government corruption and political misconduct. Seated in the front row of the press gallery, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett represented everything that Leavitt and her political movement claimed to oppose. As one of the most effective investigators in Congress, Jasmine had earned a reputation for fearless pursuit of political corruption regardless of party affiliation or political consequences. Her methodical approach to evidence gathering and her ability to expose high-level criminal activity had already claimed several major political scalps, and her presence at today's briefing suggested that she had uncovered something significant about the current administration or its allies. The contrast between the two women could not have been more stark. It went far beyond their obvious physical differences. Leavitt embodied the kind of aggressive, combative political style that had come to dominate conservative media and politics, while Jasmine represented a more measured, evidence-based approach to political accountability. Where Leavitt relied on inflammatory rhetoric and personal attacks, Jasmine built her cases through careful documentation and methodical presentation of facts. Where Leavitt sought to inflame passions and divide audiences, Jasmine sought to illuminate truth and hold powerful people accountable for their actions. The briefing had begun routinely enough, with Leavitt delivering prepared remarks about legislative priorities and administration policies. But the tone had shifted dramatically when she began addressing what she termed the ongoing persecution of patriotic Americans by radical elements within Congress. Her language had become increasingly heated as she described congressional oversight activities as un-American harassment and communist-style persecution of political opponents. When the briefing opened to questions from the press corps, the tension in the room became palpable. Several reporters had attempted to ask substantive questions about policy matters and administrative decisions, But Leavitt had deflected these inquiries to focus on her preferred narrative about political persecution and anti-American sentiment among Democratic politicians. The explosion came when Jasmine was recognized to ask a question. She had risen from her seat with characteristic grace and composure, her leather portfolio in hand, prepared to ask what appeared to be a straightforward question about government accountability and transparency measures. Ms. Leavitt, Jasmine had begun in her calm, professional tone. Given your frequent statements about the importance of American values and traditional morality, I wanted to ask about accountability measures for government officials who may have violated public trust or engaged in criminal activity. The question was diplomatic and procedural, the kind of inquiry that would normally receive a standard political response about the administration's commitment to ethical governance and legal compliance. But something in Jasmine's tone, or perhaps simply her presence and reputation as an investigator, had triggered an explosive response from Leavitt that revealed the depth of her animosity and the extremity of her worldview. I find it rich, Leavitt had responded, her voice dripping with contempt, that someone like you would question American values and traditional morality. You represent everything that's wrong with this country, everything that threatens the America that real Americans love and want to preserve. The personal nature of the attack had been immediately obvious to everyone in the room, but Leavitt had been just getting started. Her voice had risen with each word, her carefully maintained professional composure giving way to something much more raw and revealing. You and people like you hate America, she had continued, her finger pointing directly at Jasmine. You hate our history, you hate our traditions, you hate our values. You spend every day trying to tear down everything that makes America great, everything that real Americans hold sacred. The accusations have been inflammatory enough on their own, but they represented only the beginning of what would become one of the most shocking displays of racism and hatred ever captured in an official government setting. You know what the real problem is? Leavitt had asked, her voice now loud enough to echo off the walls of the briefing room. The real problem is that people like you think you belong here. You think you have the right to come into our country, into our government, into our institutions, and tell us how to live. The room had fallen completely silent, with even the most experienced political reporters struggling to process what they were hearing from the podium of the White House press briefing room. Well, let me tell you something, Leavitt had continued, her voice now carrying the kind of venom that suggested she had moved far beyond prepared talking points into something much more personal and revealing. This is our country. This is our government. These are our institutions. And if you don't like it, if you can't respect it, if you can't appreciate what real Americans have built here, then maybe you should go back to Africa where you came from. The words had hit the room like a physical blow. Several reporters had audibly gasped. Camera operators had adjusted their equipment to ensure they were capturing every moment, and the assembled journalists had leaned forward in their seats as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in American political history. You don't belong in America, Leavitt had added, her voice now shrill with emotion. You don't belong in our government, you don't belong in our Congress, and you certainly don't belong questioning real Americans about values and morality that you could never understand. But even as the room had erupted in shocked whispers and urgent note-taking, Jasmine had remained perfectly calm. She had not flinched at the racist attack, had not responded with anger or outrage, had not given Leavitt the emotional reaction that she was clearly seeking. Instead, she had simply smiled with the kind of knowing expression that had become her trademark in moments of political confrontation. Ms. Leavitt, Jasmine had replied, her voice carrying the same calm professionalism it had held at the beginning of the exchange. I appreciate your passion about American values and your concern about people who belong in this country. Those are indeed important topics that deserve careful discussion. The measured nature of her response had created an almost surreal contrast with Leavitt's racist tirade, making Leavitt appear unhinged and irrational while positioning Jasmine as the voice of reason and dignity. Since you've raised these important questions about belonging in America and respecting our institutions, Jasmine had continued, perhaps we could examine them in some detail. After all, if we're going to discuss who belongs in America and who understands American values, We should make sure we have all the relevant facts before us. Something in Jasmine's tone had made Leavitt's aggressive posture falter slightly. The wild energy that had characterized her racist attack seemed to crystallize into something more focused, more wary. What facts? Leavitt had demanded, though her voice lacked the confident aggression it had carried moments before. Jasmine had opened her leather portfolio for the first time, withdrawing a thick manila folder marked with what appeared to be official government seals and immigration service stamps. "I'm talking about these documents," she had said simply, holding up the folder so that the cameras could capture its official markings. Immigration records, naturalization documents, and federal investigation files that tell a very interesting story about belonging in America and respecting our institutions. Leavitt's face had gone noticeably pale, but she had managed to respond. "What documents? What are you talking about?" "Actually, I think we should start with your family's immigration history," Jasmine had replied, removing the first document from her folder. "Since you've expressed such strong views about who belongs in America and who doesn't." She had held up what appeared to be historical immigration records bearing the seals of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. "These are INS records from 1923 documenting the arrival of your great-grandfather, Patrick Leavitt, from County Cork, Ireland. According to these records, Patrick Leavitt entered the United States using fraudulent documentation and false identity papers." The revelation had hit the briefing room like a thunderbolt. Leavitt, who had just finished delivering a racist tirade about people who didn't belong in America, was being confronted with evidence that her own family had entered the country illegally. The records show that Patrick Leavitt was actually Patrick Murphy, a fugitive from British authorities who had been wanted for theft and fraud in Ireland. He assumed the identity of a deceased Irish immigrant named Patrick Leavitt to avoid deportation and prosecution. Jasmine had consulted the immigration documents with the methodical precision that had made her famous in congressional hearings. According to federal investigators, Patrick Murphy, using the false name Patrick Leavitt, established what INS agents described as an extensive immigration fraud network that helped other Irish fugitives enter the United States using false documentation. The irony was devastating. Leavitt's family had not just been immigrants. They had been illegal immigrants who had entered the country through fraud and had helped other illegal immigrants do the same. But it gets more interesting. Jasmine had continued, reaching for another document. "These are naturalization records from 1927 showing that Patrick Leavitt obtained American citizenship using the same fraudulent documentation he had used to enter the country." She had held up the naturalization certificate so that the cameras could capture its official seals and signatures. According to federal investigators, Patrick Leavitt's citizenship was obtained through perjury, fraud, and conspiracy. He lied about his identity, his criminal background, and his eligibility for naturalization. The implications were staggering. If Leavitt's great-grandfather had obtained citizenship fraudulently, it could potentially affect the citizenship status of his descendants, including Leavitt herself. The investigation also documented that Patrick Leavitt continued his criminal activities after obtaining fraudulent citizenship, Jasmine had revealed. He operated what federal agents described as a sophisticated organized crime network involved in bootlegging, gambling, and protection rackets throughout the 1920s and 1930s. But the immigration fraud was only the beginning of what Jasmine had uncovered about the Leavitt family's criminal history. Your family's connection to organized crime continued through subsequent generations, she had announced, reaching for what appeared to be FBI case files and criminal investigation records. "These are FBI records documenting the activities of your grandfather, Michael Leavitt, who continued the family tradition of criminal enterprise through the 1940s and 1950s. She had consulted the FBI files with the same methodical approach she had used for the immigration documents. According to federal investigators, Michael Leavitt was involved in what the FBI described as extensive racketeering activities, including illegal gambling, loan sharking, and tax evasion. He was suspected of having connections to several organized crime families operating in the Northeast. The FBI records showed a pattern of criminal activity that spanned decades and involved multiple family members. Michael Leavitt was investigated in connection with several unsolved murders during the 1950s, though he was never formally charged due to what FBI agents described as witness intimidation and corruption of local law enforcement officials. But even the organized crime connections paled in comparison to what Jasmine revealed next about Leavitt's more recent family history. However, the most serious criminal activity involves your father, Robert Leavitt, and his systematic embezzlement for veterans' charitable organizations. Jasmine had announced, producing what appeared to be federal court documents and financial investigation records. Leavitt's face had gone completely white, and her hands were visibly trembling as she gripped the podium. According to federal investigators, Robert Leavitt has been operating what prosecutors describe as one of the largest charity fraud schemes in American history, systematically stealing donations intended for disabled veterans and their families. The allegations were both heartbreaking and infuriating, stealing money that was meant to help America's most vulnerable veterans. These are Justice Department records documenting a federal investigation into Leavitt Family Charitable Foundation and associated organizations that your father has been using to embezzle funds donated by generous Americans who believed they were helping veterans in need. Jasmine had spread the financial investigation documents across the White House podium with the systematic precision of a prosecutor building a case. Between 2015 and 2024, federal investigators have documented that Robert Leavitt embezzled over $200 million from veterans' charities. The money was diverted through shell companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent administrative expenses. The scope of the theft was staggering, representing not just a massive financial crime, but a betrayal of the trust of thousands of Americans who had donated money to help veterans. The investigation shows that less than 3% of donated funds actually reached veterans or their families. The remaining 97% was stolen by your father and used to fund lavish personal expenses, luxury real estate purchases, and offshore investment accounts. But the veterans' charity fraud was only one part of a larger pattern of criminal activity that Jasmine had uncovered. Federal investigators have also documented that Robert Leavitt used the Veterans Charity Network to facilitate money laundering for other criminal organizations, she had revealed. According to Treasury Department records, the Leavitt charitable organizations were used to launder money from drug trafficking, human trafficking, and international organized crime syndicates. The money laundering allegations elevated the case from charity fraud to participation in international criminal conspiracies. The investigation shows that your father's charitable organizations processed over $500 million in criminal proceeds between 2018 and 2024, making him a key figure in what federal prosecutors describe as a global money laundering network. But even these serious criminal allegations were overshadowed by what Jasmine revealed next about Leavitt's own criminal activities. However, the most disturbing evidence concerns your own involvement in criminal activity. Jasmine had announced, reaching for what appear to be federal surveillance reports and investigative files. These are FBI surveillance records documenting your operation of what federal investigators describe as a sophisticated sex trafficking network operating through your political campaign offices and associated organizations. The allegation was so shocking that several reporters in the briefing room audibly gasped, and camera operators immediately adjusted their equipment to ensure they were capturing every moment of Leavitt's reaction. According to federal investigators, you have been using your political campaigns and associated organizations as cover for what they describe as an extensive human trafficking operation targeting vulnerable young women. Leavitt tried to mount a response, but her voice came out as a strangled whisper. That's impossible. I would never. The FBI investigation has documented that you've been recruiting young women under the pretense of offering them political internships and campaign positions. Jasmine continued relentlessly. Once these women are under your control, they're forced into what federal agents describe as commercial sexual exploitation. The systematic nature of the sex trafficking operation was both sophisticated and horrifying. Federal surveillance has identified at least 127 victims who have been trafficked through your network between 2020 and 2024. The victims range in age from 16 to 23, and many were recruited from vulnerable populations, including foster care systems, homeless shelters, and immigrant communities. The human cost of Leavitt's crimes was staggering and heartbreaking. According to victim testimonies collected by federal investigators, you personally participated in what they describe as grooming, coercion, and violent enforcement to maintain control over trafficking victims. Jasmine had produced what appeared to be sworn statements and victim testimonies documenting the brutal reality of Leavitt's trafficking operation. This victim statement from Maria Santos, age 19, describes how you recruited her with promises of a paid internship in your congressional campaign, then forced her into prostitution through threats, violence, and drug dependency. The victim testimonies were devastating in their detail and emotional impact. Another victim, Jennifer Walsh, age 20, describes being held in what she calls campaign housing, but which federal investigators have identified as locations used to imprison trafficking victims. But the domestic trafficking operation was only part of a larger international criminal network that Leavitt had been operating. Federal investigators have also documented your connections to international sex trafficking networks operating between the United States and Eastern Europe, Jasmine had revealed. According to Interpol reports, your trafficking network has been coordinating with organized crime groups in Ukraine, Russia, and other former Soviet states to import victims for commercial sexual exploitation in the United States. The international connections elevated Leavitt's crimes from domestic sex trafficking to participation in global organized crime. The investigation shows that you've been personally involved in transporting victims across international borders using fraudulent documentation and corrupt immigration officials. But perhaps the most shocking revelation concerned Leavitt's connections to other high-profile figures involved in similar criminal activities. Federal investigators have also documented your connections to the Jeffrey Epstein trafficking network and other organized crime figures involved in commercial sexual exploitation, Jasmine had announced. According to FBI records, you maintained regular contact with several Epstein associates even after his arrest and conviction for sex trafficking charges. The Epstein connection suggested that Leavitt's criminal activities were part of a much larger network of powerful figures involved in similar crimes. Financial records show that you received payments from several offshore accounts that were previously used by the Epstein organization to fund trafficking operations and to pay bribes to law enforcement officials. The financial connections to the Epstein network provided additional evidence of Leavitt's involvement in organized sex trafficking. The investigation also shows that you used many of the same methods as the Epstein organization, including the use of political and business connections to recruit victims and to avoid prosecution. But even the Epstein connections were overshadowed by evidence of Leavitt's involvement in violence against victims who tried to escape or report her crimes. Federal investigators have documented that your trafficking network has been involved in what they describe as extreme violence against victims who attempted to escape or cooperate with law enforcement, Jasmine had revealed. According to FBI records, at least 12 women who were involved in your trafficking network have died under suspicious circumstances between 2020 and 2024. The murder allegations transformed the case from sex trafficking to potential serial killing. This police report from the Atlanta Police Department documents the death of Sarah Connor, age 21, who was found dead in a hotel room just 3 days after she contacted the FBI about your trafficking operation. The suspicious deaths created a pattern that suggested systematic elimination of potential witnesses. Another case involves Lisa Rodriguez, age 24, who died in what was ruled a drug overdose just 1 week after she escaped from one of your trafficking locations and sought help from a victims advocacy organization. Federal investigators suspected that the deaths were not coincidental, but were part of a deliberate strategy to silence potential witnesses and maintain control over the trafficking network. The FBI investigation has identified evidence suggesting that these deaths were not accidental, but were orchestrated to prevent victims from cooperating with law enforcement or exposing the extent of your criminal activities. But even the murder allegations were not the most serious charges that federal investigators were preparing against Leavitt. However, The gravest allegations concern your potential involvement in international terrorism and your connections to hostile foreign intelligence services. Jasmine had announced, reaching for what appeared to be classified intelligence documents. These are intelligence assessments documenting your potential recruitment and operation as an asset of Russian intelligence services. The terrorism and espionage allegations elevated Leavitt's case from organized crime to national security threats. According to CIA counterintelligence reports, you have been identified as what Russian intelligence services call a useful idiot, an American political figure who can be manipulated to serve Russian interests without necessarily realizing they're being used. The intelligence reports suggested that Leavitt's political career had been supported and directed by foreign intelligence services for their own strategic purposes. The assessment indicates that your rapid rise in conservative politics was facilitated by what intelligence analysts describe as sophisticated foreign influence operations designed to place Russian assets in positions of influence within American government. But the evidence suggested that Leavitt was not just a passive victim of foreign manipulation, but was an active participant in espionage activities. NSA intercepts show that you have been in direct communication with known Russian intelligence operatives, providing them with classified information and strategic intelligence about American political activities. The espionage charges were supported by specific evidence of unauthorized disclosure of classified information. According to intelligence reports, you provided Russian intelligence services with detailed information about American political strategies, government security measures, and the identities of intelligence officers working overseas. The information that Leavitt had allegedly provided to Russian intelligence services had compromised American national security operations and endangered the lives of intelligence personnel. Federal investigators believe that your unauthorized disclosures resulted in the compromise of at least 6 American intelligence operations and contributed to the capture and execution of several American intelligence officers by Russian authorities. The human cost of Leavitt's alleged treason was both tragic and infuriating. The intelligence assessments also suggest that you have been working with Russian intelligence services to coordinate disinformation campaigns designed to undermine American democratic institutions and promote Russian strategic interests. The disinformation operations represented an additional form of attack on American democracy and national security. According to counterintelligence reports, you have been instrumental in spreading what Russian intelligence services call active measures, disinformation designed to create political chaos and undermine public confidence in American institutions. But perhaps the most shocking revelation concerned evidence that Leavitt had been planning domestic terrorist attacks in coordination with foreign intelligence services. Current FBI investigations have identified evidence suggesting that you have been involved in planning what federal investigators describe as coordinated domestic terrorism attacks designed to create maximum chaos and instability, Jasmine had revealed. According to confidential informants, you have been working with domestic extremist groups and foreign intelligence operatives to plan simultaneous attacks on government facilities, media organizations, and political targets. The domestic terrorism planning represented the culmination of Leavitt's criminal activities and her betrayal of American interests. The investigation has documented meetings where you discussed specific targets, weapons procurement, and tactical coordination for what participants described as accelerated destabilization operations against the United States. Federal investigators had gathered evidence of detailed planning for attacks that would have caused massive casualties and could have triggered widespread political violence. FBI surveillance has recorded you discussing plans to bomb federal buildings, assassinate political leaders, and coordinate simultaneous attacks designed to overwhelm law enforcement response capabilities. The terrorism planning included coordination with international terrorist organizations and hostile foreign intelligence services. Intelligence reports show that your domestic terrorism network has been receiving funding, weapons, and tactical support from Russian intelligence services and other foreign entities seeking to destabilize American democracy. But even as Jasmine methodically presented this overwhelming evidence of criminal activity, treason, and terrorism, Leavitt had been unable to mount any coherent response. The woman who had opened the briefing with a racist tirade about who belonged in America was now being confronted with evidence that she herself was not only a criminal, but potentially a foreign agent working to destroy the country she claimed to represent. Her carefully constructed public image as a defender of American values had been systematically demolished by evidence of her own crimes against America and her betrayal of everything the country stood for. Ms. Leavitt, Jasmine had concluded, her voice taking on a tone of finality. You began this briefing by telling me to go back to Africa because you claimed I didn't belong in America. You questioned my right to be here, my loyalty to this country, and my understanding of American values. She had gestured toward all the evidence spread across the White House podium. But the evidence shows that you are the one who doesn't belong here. You are the one who has betrayed American values. You are the one who has worked with foreign enemies to harm this country. The irony was devastating and complete. Your family came here illegally through fraud and deception. Your family has been involved in organized crime for generations. You have personally stolen money from American veterans, trafficked vulnerable women and children, murdered witnesses, and worked with foreign intelligence services to betray your own country. Jasmine had begun organizing her documents with calm efficiency. So when you tell me to go back to Africa, I think the American people should know that you are the one who doesn't belong here. You are the one who hates America so much that you're willing to work with our enemies to destroy it. Leavitt had been unable to respond coherently to any of the allegations. She stood at the White House podium, surrounded by the wreckage of her political career and facing the prospect of prosecution for some of the most serious crimes in American law. The briefing room had fallen in a stunned silence as the full scope of Leavitt's criminal activities and betrayals became clear. Federal agents, who had been waiting outside the briefing room, entered to execute arrest warrants that had been sealed pending Leavitt's public exposure. The woman who had delivered one of the most racist attacks ever captured in an official government setting was now being arrested on charges that could result in the death penalty. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Leavitt looked back at Jasmine with an expression of complete defeat and desperation. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though her apology could not undo the damage she had caused to her victims or the country she had betrayed. The irony was not lost on anyone who had witnessed the briefing. The person who had questioned Jasmine's right to be in America was being arrested as a traitor who had worked with foreign enemies to destroy America. The woman who had claimed to represent American values was being exposed as someone who had systematically violated every principle the country stood for. In the hours following Leavitt's arrest, the political and media response was swift and overwhelming. The racist attack on Jasmine had been captured on live television and immediately went viral across social media platforms, generating millions of views and widespread condemnation from political leaders across the political spectrum. But the criminal revelations that followed the racist attack created an even bigger story that dominated news coverage for weeks. Federal prosecutors announced that Leavitt would face charges including sex trafficking, murder, embezzlement, money laundering, espionage, and domestic terrorism, some of the most serious crimes in American law. The case against her family members, including her father's $200 million embezzlement from veteran charities, resulted in additional arrests and prosecutions that destroyed the entire Leavitt criminal network. The sex trafficking investigation expanded to include dozens of co-conspirators and led to the rescue of over 100 victims who had been held in locations across multiple states. International law enforcement agencies coordinated investigations into the foreign intelligence connections and terrorist planning that Leavitt had been involved in. The revelations about her family's fraudulent immigration history raised questions about her own citizenship status and eligibility to serve in government positions. For Jasmine Crockett, the confrontation represented another milestone in her growing reputation as America's most effective corruption investigator. But she remained focused on the broader implications of the case rather than personal vindication. This case demonstrates how racism, crime, and betrayal of American values often go hand in hand, she told reporters following Leavitt's arrest. People who attack others based on race or nationality are often trying to distract attention from their own criminal activities and their own failures to live up to American ideals. The case also highlighted the importance of thorough background investigations for government officials and the need for enhanced security measures to prevent foreign intelligence penetration of American political institutions. Legal experts noted that the combination of criminal charges that Leavitt faced made this one of the most comprehensive prosecution cases ever brought against a government official. The evidence of sex trafficking, murder, and terrorism meant that federal prosecutors would likely seek the death penalty for the most serious charges. The international implications of the case led to diplomatic protests from several foreign governments and demands for enhanced security cooperation to prevent similar infiltration in the future. But perhaps most importantly, the case demonstrated that racism and criminal activity often went hand in hand, and that those who questioned others' right to belong in America were often the ones who had forfeited their own right through their crimes against the country. The woman who had told Jasmine to go back to Africa was now facing the prospect of spending the rest of her life in an American federal prison, assuming she avoided execution for her crimes against America. The irony was complete, the justice was appropriate, and the lesson was clear. In America, those who betray the country's values through racism and crime will ultimately be held accountable, regardless of their political position or public image. The truth had prevailed over racism, evidence had defeated hatred, and justice had triumphed over those who sought to destroy America from within while claiming to defend it. The briefing was over, but the investigation continued, and America was stronger for having confronted and defeated those who sought to harm it while hiding behind patriotic rhetoric and racist attacks. The real Americans were those who defended justice and equality, not those who used racism to distract from their own criminal betrayal of everything America stood for.